in the quiet stillness of a warm spring morning in 2002. Deep in the pine-covered woods of rural Mississippi, a logger named Dale McKinney was going about his routine. Chainsaw in hand, he was clearing deadwood from a stretch of forest that hadn't been touched in decades. As he stepped toward an old, gnarled tree stump, one that looked like it had stood for generations, his boot hit something strange buried beneath the roots. Something not wood, not rock. At first, he thought it was just old junk, maybe a metal bucket rusted over with time. But as he knelt and cleared away the soil, what he unearthed would send ripples through an entire community and reopen a mystery that had haunted families and neighbors for over 25 years. It all began in 1977, in a small southern town where everyone seemed to know everyone. It was a time of change, a time of tension, but also of hope. The heart of that hope was a man named Reverend Elijah Ramsey, a kind-eyed black pastor in his early 40s, known for his sermons that blended fire and compassion in equal measure. He wasn't just a preacher behind the pulpit. He was a counselor, a voice for the voiceless, and a quiet leader who stood tall in the face of challenges most people wouldn't dare acknowledge. Reverend Ramsey had come to this town just a few years earlier, drawn by a sense of calling. He believed in healing wounds, not just spiritual ones, but the deep, silent scars that divided communities. He believed in showing up, not just on Sundays, but whenever someone needed him. His small church, nestled off a gravel road lined with cottonwood trees, had quickly become more than a place of worship. 'Twas a safe haven, a place where the doors were always open, day or night. But in the summer of '77, everything changed. It started with a missed service. That Sunday, the church doors stayed locked. The pastor's car was still in the driveway, keys inside. The lights were off, and Reverend Ramsey was nowhere to be found. At first, folks thought he might have just taken a short trip or gone to visit family. But days passed, then weeks, and soon whispers replaced hopeful explanations. There were no signs of forced entry at his home. No note, no calls, no witnesses. He had simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The police launched an investigation, but with no leads and no body, the case went cold fast. The small town's law enforcement didn't have the resources, or, some would later argue, the urgency to keep digging. Over time, theories bubbled up. Some believed he had run away, overwhelmed by the pressure of his role. Others suspected foul play, pointing to the quiet tension that had existed between him and a few influential voices who didn't like the way he was bringing people together across lines that had long been drawn in silence. Still, the mystery of Reverend Ramsey faded into the background, becoming just another story passed down in hushed tones, another photo in a dusty church hallway. Life went on. New pastors came and went. The town moved forward, but never quite forgot. Not really. And then, 25 years later, that logger found something beneath the roots of a fallen tree. It wasn't just what he found, but how it had been placed carefully, deliberately, as if someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed hidden forever. When authorities were called to the scene, the area was immediately roped off. The discovery wasn't announced publicly for several days as forensic teams examined the site. What they recovered didn't just point to Reverend Ramsey's final resting place, it raised more questions than it answered. Who buried him there, deep in woods he was never known to visit? Why were certain personal items left beside him? A pocket Bible, a broken wristwatch, a photograph of a family no one could identify. And perhaps most chilling of all, why was there no sign of trauma, no clear indication of what had caused his death? As news broke and headlines ran with the rediscovery, the town found itself reliving the grief and uncertainty it had buried years ago. People who had known Reverend Ramsey were older now, their memories blurred by time, but the ache was just as sharp. Some wept, others demanded answers, and a few, quietly, feared the truth would be more painful than the not knowing had ever been. What happened to Reverend Elijah Ramsey in 1977? Was it a crime that someone tried to cover up? A tragic accident? Or something more complex, buried beneath the surface of a community trying to heal from its own past? This story isn't just about a mystery or an old case reopened. It's about memory, silence, and how the truth sometimes takes its time coming to light. It's about one man's mission to unite people, and the shadows that mission might have stirred in the hearts of others. It's about faith, resilience, and the quiet power of refusing to forget. As we go deeper into this story, we'll talk to those who knew him. We'll explore what the original investigation missed, and what secrets may still lie hidden in plain sight. We'll look into the changes in the town over the decades and why, even today, some people are still hesitant to speak about what they might have seen or heard all those years ago. Because this isn't just a story about the past. It's a story that's still unfolding. Long before Reverend Elijah Ramsey vanished, he was already becoming someone people noticed, not just for his sermons, but for the way he lived among the people. In a town that was still wrestling with old wounds, Elijah didn't take sides. He simply showed up. He sat with grieving mothers, mentored teenagers with no fathers at home, and listened without judgment to those who had been written off by others. His church, though small, pulsed with life. Some people said the air felt different inside those walls, like hope clung to the wooden beams above the pews. He wasn't from that town originally. He had moved there from Birmingham just a few years before, leaving behind a growing congregation and a more comfortable life. No one really knew why. Some said he came after losing his wife. Others whispered he was running from something, though no evidence ever supported that. The truth may have been simpler, that Elijah believed change had to start in places where people had stopped expecting it. And this little town, quiet and split down long-drawn lines, felt like the kind of place that needed more than just words. It needed someone who could sit in silence and still speak peace. But as his presence grew stronger, so did quiet opposition. Elijah didn't stir controversy with fire and anger. He did it by crossing invisible lines. He welcomed everyone into his church, regardless of where they sat in the diner or how their fathers had voted. He encouraged joint events with neighboring churches, some of which hadn't even spoken to each other in years. He hosted potlucks where black and white families ate at the same tables. To many, it was beautiful. To a few, it was uncomfortable. And in places like this, discomfort could become dangerous in the wrong hands. There were rumors back then. Whispers of anonymous letters. Cars seen idling outside his home late at night. Once his mailbox had been smashed, nothing major, but enough to make some of his friends uneasy. He shrugged it off. Always calm, always patient. God handles what man can't, he'd say. And yet, even he seemed quieter in those final weeks before he disappeared. He shortened his sermons, smiled less often. He stopped walking alone at night, something he used to enjoy. Then came the night he vanished. His last known appearance was at a Wednesday evening prayer meeting. A dozen or so people were there, most of them regulars. Nothing unusual had happened. He led prayer, shared a brief message about forgiveness, and hugged the Johnson twins as they left with their mother. No one reported seeing anything odd. No arguments. No strangers hanging around. But by morning, he was gone. His home looked undisturbed. His wallet sat on the kitchen table. A cup of cold tea rested beside his favorite chair, the one he used to sit in and read scripture. His Bible was still open to the book of Amos. A single bookmark sat neatly inside. No clothes were missing from his closet. His suitcase untouched. No signs of struggle. It was as if he had just stepped out and never stepped back in. When authorities arrived, they treated it as a possible voluntary disappearance at first. There was no immediate evidence of foul play. No body, no blood, no fingerprints out of place. But his congregation knew better. Elijah wasn't the kind of man to just walk away, not without saying goodbye. His sister, Lorraine, who lived 3 towns over, drove in the next morning and stayed for weeks, knocking on doors, handing out flyers, begging for anyone to come forward with anything. But there was only silence, and that silence stretched into months. Eventually, the investigation slowed. Other matters took priority. The official report labeled him as missing with no evidence of what might have happened. The church tried to hold on, but without Elijah's presence, it felt hollow. The building fell into disrepair, then closed within 2 years. His house was sold. Time moved forward, even as the people closest to him still carried that wound. Always fresh, just under the surface. And then Dale McKinney, a man with no connection to any of it, stumbled onto something buried in earth and memory. The site where Dale made his discovery wasn't anywhere near Elijah's home or the church. It was a dense stretch of woods on land owned by a timber company 20 miles out from town. Not a place someone would just end up. Not a place anyone would think to search. The stump itself was old, rooted deep into the earth. Dale had been working around it for days before noticing that the ground nearby had started to shift unnaturally, a soft patch where there shouldn't have been one. When he began digging to investigate a possible sinkhole, his shovel hit metal dot at first. He thought it was just an old toolbox. But it wasn't. It was a locked, rusted container, and inside it were several personal items preserved better than anyone would expect after decades underground. A photograph with faded edges, a folded handkerchief with embroidered initials, ER, a small Bible, cracked but intact, and beneath those what appeared to be the corner of fabric, dark, weather-worn, but unmistakably a piece of clothing. Dale immediately contacted the sheriff's department. The site was sealed off within hours. Forensics were called in from Jackson. What they discovered was carefully documented and, for a time, not released to the public. But word got out. It always does. When news reached those who had known Elijah, reactions were mixed. Some were hopeful that maybe now, at last, they'd have answers. Others were fearful that what would be uncovered might finally confirm the worst of the rumors that had long lingered in the back of people's minds. The town began talking again. People who hadn't spoken about Elijah Ramsey in years were suddenly remembering details. Recollections blurred with time, but sharpened by the return of the mystery. Questions began to resurface. Why would his remains, if it was truly him, be buried so far from where he lived? Who would have the means to transport and conceal a body so deliberately? And more haunting still, why were the items in that box placed so carefully, as if whoever left them wanted them to be found one day? A new investigation was opened, but so far, few answers have come. Some records from 1977 are missing. Witnesses have passed away. And those who are still alive, well, not everyone wants to remember. Not everyone is ready to talk. But the story isn't over. Far from it. Because if someone went to that much trouble to hide a man like Elijah Ramsey, they had a reason. And reasons leave trails. Even after When the investigation reopened, Sheriff Darrell Moore was the one who took the lead. He'd been just a rookie deputy back in 1977, barely 23, fresh out of training. He still remembered the day Elijah disappeared. He'd been one of the first officers called to the scene. Now in his 60s, with more gray than black in his hair and a cautious gait from old injuries. He walked the same woods with a heavy heart. There was a quiet guilt in his voice whenever he spoke about Reverend Ramsey. "We should have looked harder," he said more than once. "Should have asked better questions. Maybe pushed where it wasn't comfortable." Daryl wasn't the only one wrestling with old shadows. Lorraine Ramsey returned to town after the news broke, her suitcase worn, her eyes sharper than ever. She'd spent most of her adult life chasing leads, following whispers, mailing letters to newspapers and pastors and retired officers. She never gave up. Her brother's memory had become a part of her identity, a quiet mission stitched into every year she lived. She didn't come back just to mourn. She came to find out what really happened as authorities sifted through the evidence, trying to confirm the identity of the remains. The town began to unravel in small, uneasy ways. The local diner became a place of whispered conversations again. Faces that hadn't been seen in years reappeared. One of them was Harold Boyd, a retired logging contractor who'd worked that forest land in the 80s. He claimed he saw something back then he couldn't explain, an area of disturbed ground, oddly fenced off with wire. He'd mentioned it to a supervisor, but nothing came of it. Another thread came from a former church deacon, Thomas Hargrove. He'd once been close to Elijah, but something had caused a rift between them months before the pastor's disappearance. Thomas was in his late 70s now, living in a care home outside town. When asked about those final months, his answers were vague. But once, during a late-night conversation with a visiting reporter, he said something strange. There were people who didn't want change, and they were louder than we thought. That one sentence began to pull at something deeper. Elijah Ramsey had been working on a community housing project before he vanished. Low-income homes built on donated land. It was a partnership with churches from nearby counties. The plans had already drawn interest, even some small grants. But not everyone supported the idea. There were quiet objections from business owners and land developers who didn't want new neighborhoods changing the landscape. One name that came up in old records was Milton Crane, a wealthy man who'd once owned several properties around the town square. Back then, Crane was a powerful figure, the kind who never ran for office but always seemed to get his way. Crane passed away a decade ago, but his son, Alan Crane, now runs the family's holdings. When approached for comment, Alan dismissed any connection. "That was long before my time," he said. "My father never mentioned the pastor. I was a child when that happened." Still, something about the way he said it, too clean, too rehearsed, left people wondering. Meanwhile, local reporter Jenny Malone had begun digging through old archives. She found that several documents related to the housing project had disappeared from county records. Meeting minutes, funding proposals, even letters from Elijah to the Planning Commission, all missing. She also found a photograph that hadn't been published before. It showed Elijah standing beside a group of volunteers on the land designated for the housing project. In the background, half hidden behind a truck, stood a man who bore a striking resemblance to Milton Crane. No one remembered him being part of the initiative. The discovery sparked more questions. Was the housing project the reason someone wanted Elijah silenced? Or was there something else buried? Not just in the woods, but in old secrets held too long. Back at the sheriff's office, Daryl began reopening files, including statements from people who'd been overlooked in the original case. One file belonged to a teenager at the time named Calvin Drew. He'd claimed he saw Reverend Ramsey get into a dark car late one night a week before he disappeared. No one followed up then. Calvin had moved away shortly after. Now, after tracking him down in Memphis, Daryl asked if he remembered anything more. Calvin, now in his 40s, hesitated at first. Then he said, "I wasn't supposed to be out that night. My uncle told me to never bring it up again." When pressed about the man in the car, Calvin shook his head. "I couldn't see his face, but the car had a broken taillight. I'll never forget that." A few days later, Lorraine Ramsey got a call from someone who refused to leave a name. The voice was shaky, older. All the caller said was, he trusted the wrong person. He told someone about the land deal, and they told the wrong ears. Then they hung up. The investigation had turned into something bigger than anyone expected. It wasn't just about a missing pastor anymore. It was about power, about silence, and the way truth sometimes gets buried, not because it's lost, but because someone makes sure it stays hidden. Even as the DNA results were still pending, people in town felt the weight of something returning. Not everyone welcomed it. A local church was vandalized one night. Someone spray-painted across the doors, "Let the dead rest." The sheriff increased patrols. Lorraine refused to leave. She started meeting with people one by one. Former parishioners, old friends, even those who'd once stood against her brother's work. Some opened up, others stayed quiet. But slowly, pieces started falling into place. Not enough to finish the puzzle, but enough to see that it was much bigger than anyone thought. And in the middle of it all was Elijah Ramsey, a man whose life still echoed across time, pulling people towards something that felt unfinished, something that had been waiting beneath the soil, waiting to be uncovered. The truth hadn't come out yet, but the air in town felt different now. It wasn't just the weight of memory or the presence of reporters showing up with notepads and cameras. It was tension, quiet but heavy, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. Conversations that had once been whispers behind closed doors were starting to reach porches and parking lots. People who had once refused to say a word were beginning to glance over their shoulders before speaking. But still, no one came forward with the full truth. Sheriff Darrell Moore kept his circle small. He didn't trust everyone on his team anymore. Too many years had passed. Too many names from the past still carried weight. He spent nights rereading witness statements from 1977. Cross-checking them with town maps and newspaper clippings, Jenny Malone helped him dig up. The more he searched, the more inconsistencies began to pile up. Timelines that didn't line up, testimonies that contradicted each other, and names that kept reappearing without explanation. One of those names was James Tully. Back then, James had been just another man in town, worked maintenance at the courthouse, kept to himself. Not particularly known, not particularly liked. But in Elijah's journals, recovered years ago and stored in Loren's attic, there were 2 short entries that mentioned Tully directly. One simply read, "Tully asked about the housing site today. Odd, never showed interest before." And the next, dated just days later, said, "Something feels off. Need to pray on who I'm trusting." No one had followed up on Tully in the original investigation. When Darrell tried to find him now, he discovered Tully had moved out of state. In the early 80s, traced to a town in Arkansas. Alone, no family. He'd passed away in 1996, cause of death, stroke. But his departure from town so soon after Elijah's disappearance and his quiet, unremarkable life afterward raised more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, Lorraine got a second call. This time, the voice was clearer, an older woman. She didn't say her name, but she said she once attended Elijah's church. "We tried to tell him to slow down," she said. "We told him to be careful, but he believed people would do the right thing if they just saw the truth. He didn't. Realized truth scares folks." Then she hung up. That call haunted Lorraine for days, Jenny Malone. Following her instincts, went back to the land where Elijah's remains were found. She walked deeper into the woods, past the stump, past the tape still hanging from trees like faded warnings. About 40 yards from the site, she found something strange. The remains of an old campsite. Broken pieces of wood. A rusted fire pit. And, wedged into the soil, almost completely buried, a length of chain. It was old, thick, industrial, not something a hunter would use. She took photos, then brought it to the sheriff. Darrell called in forensics again. The new site was tested, and though nothing definitive came back, the positioning of the campsite and the signs of disturbed soil nearby pointed to the possibility that Elijah hadn't been buried immediately. That someone may have held him out here, in these woods, for some time before he was killed. Or worse, before he simply died waiting. This theory changed everything. It meant the burial was careful. It meant there was time, planning, and maybe even more people involved. The sheriff began revisiting names tied to the town's planning board back in the late 70s. That board had quietly blocked Elijah's housing initiative, even though no public record explained why. One name stood out: Reverend Curtis Denton, a man who had once pastored a much larger church in town, who had never gotten along with Elijah. Denton was known for being traditional, conservative, resistant to what he called disruption. He had been in a position of influence back then, with ties to many of the men who controlled land and money around the county. Denton was still alive, nearly 90, in a care facility. Darrell decided to pay him a visit. The conversation was short. Denton claimed he remembered little. His voice was thin but steady. When asked about Elijah Ramsey, he simply said he was a good man. Maybe too good for his own safety. And when Darrell asked if Denton had ever visited the housing site or had any objections to it, Denton turned to face the window and said, "We all had to protect what was ours back then. You wouldn't understand." He never said another word about it. As tension grew, Lorraine began to worry about her own safety. She received an envelope one morning with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 1977, an article about Elisha's final sermon, and a short message scribbled in red pen: "Some doors are better left closed." She took it straight to the sheriff, her hands trembling. But she didn't stop. If anything, it pushed her harder. She started speaking publicly: church gatherings, community halls, even in front of city council. Her message was clear: we can't heal if we keep hiding. More people came forward with fragments. A woman admitted seeing a black car parked outside the church late at night for weeks before Elijah disappeared. A retired nurse said she remembered treating a man with a severe hand injury around that time, said he claimed it was from cutting logs. But something about him had made her uneasy. Piece by piece, the story was forming, but the final truth remained out of reach. And just when the investigation seemed on the verge of collapse from all its complexity, a break came. Jenny received an anonymous tip. A man now living in Florida claimed he once helped build a hidden shed in those same woods, paid cash, no questions asked. Said it was late summer, 1977. Said the men who paid him were local. Said one of them wore a gold watch with a cracked face. That detail hit hard. Elijah's watch, recovered from the buried box, had a cracked face, and it hadn't been his style to wear flashy jewelry. But it could mean someone else had it, someone who'd taken it. Sheriff Moore followed the lead quietly. No press, no team. Just him and Jenny, traveling across state lines. And what they found there in a storage unit, locked for decades under a fake name, was enough to change everything. But what they found hasn't been revealed yet, because just as they returned to Mississippi, someone else came forward. Someone who had stayed silent for decades. Someone who had been there the night Elijah Ramsey disappeared. The man who came forward was someone no one had expected: Marcus Lee. Now in his 60s, a quiet figure who had once been part of the church choir and worked evenings at the local mill. Back in 1977, he was just 19, shy, barely spoke. In public, most people had forgotten he'd even been close to Reverend Ramsey. But he showed up at the sheriff's office without warning. Walked in with a worn backpack and a look on his face like he hadn't slept in days. When Darrell brought him into the room and closed the door, Marcus opened the bag, reached inside, and pulled out an old cassette tape, wrapped in a faded church bulletin. "I should have come forward years ago," Marcus said. "But I was scared. Still am." Daryl didn't push. He played the tape on an old deck kept for evidence recordings. The audio was grainy, muffled with age, but the voices were clear enough. On the tape was a conversation, a meeting, by the sound of it, between Reverend Ramsey and two other men. One of them was definitely Thomas Hargrove, the former deacon. The other voice was harder to place at first, but when Daryl and Jenny replayed it several times, they realized it matched an old town council member from that era, Wesley Grant. The conversation started calm, about church matters, but it shifted quickly. Elijah was heard saying, "I won't stand by and let this land be taken. It was promised to the community, and we've already broken ground." Then the tone changed. The other voice, likely Grant, responded, "You're making people nervous. Reverend, this kind of noise, it'll ruin everything. Walk away now, quietly." Elijah didn't agree. The tape cut out after a scuffle of movement and a click, like someone shutting a drawer or slamming a book. It wasn't conclusive evidence of violence, but it confirmed threats had been made. It proved there had been pressure on Elijah to abandon the housing project. And it showed that people who were supposed to be allies had turned on him in the dark. Marcus explained that he had found the tape by accident. He had helped clean out the church storage closet a few weeks after Elijah's disappearance and came across the recorder in a box. He never turned it in. "I didn't know who to trust," he said. "And then one day I heard someone say, 'That boy should mind his business.' I left town the next week." He'd been carrying the guilt ever since, but just when the tape began to crack open the truth, another shock came, this time from the forensic lab, the remains buried under the tree stump. They were human, yes, and male. But the initial results showed something unexpected. The DNA didn't match Elijah Ramsey directly. It was a familial match, close, but not exact. The lab ran further tests, and a week later, the sheriff's office received confirmation. The remains were of a man biologically related to Elijah, a half-brother, or possibly a son. The revelation hit like a lightning strike. Lorraine was stunned. Elijah had never mentioned any children. No known siblings beyond her, but the science was clear. Someone connected to him by blood had died in those woods, not Elijah. This changed everything, if the body wasn't his. Then, where was Elijah? Had he known about this person? Had he tried to protect him? Had someone else been buried in his place as a warning or a cover-up? The focus of the investigation shifted again, deeper into Elijah's personal life. Jenny began rereading every letter, every note, every journal entry. One letter stood out, unsigned, undated, tucked into the back of a hymnal found among his belongings. It read, "He doesn't know I exist, but I've seen him preach. I know I got his eyes. I just want to talk. No name, just initials. D.R. The mystery took on a new face. The man buried under the tree stump wasn't just collateral. He may have been trying to reach Elijah. Maybe finally did. Maybe someone didn't want that meeting to happen. The possibility raised painful questions. What if Elijah never disappeared? What if he was taken trying to protect someone he only just met? Sheriff Moore pulled every birth record, every adoption file he could get access to from the surrounding counties. And after 3 sleepless nights, he found something, a sealed file from 1956. A boy born in Georgia, mother unnamed, father listed only as unavailable. The child's name, David Renshaw. Renshaw had moved through foster homes most of his life, a drifter by the time he was in his 20s. No stable records, but a match to his DNA confirmed it. The body in the forest belonged to David. The tragedy deepened. It meant someone had lured both David and Elijah to the same place. Someone who had been watching, Someone who knew about a connection even Elijah might not have fully understood at the same time. Lorraine received another message, this one hand-delivered. It was a black and white photograph, weathered at the edges. It showed Elijah standing on the steps of the church, a child beside him. The photo had never been seen before. On the back, someone had written, "You're still asking the wrong question." Lorraine broke down when she saw it, not just from the shock, but because the child in the photo looked just like David. And still, Elijah's body had not been found. The town was holding its breath. People were looking at one another differently now, wondering who had known what and for how long. The old guard stayed quiet, their faces tight with unease. But others were beginning to talk, not to blame, but to finally release the fear that had held them silent for decades. Because what had happened wasn't just about a pastor or a project or a threat. It was about a choice Elijah made to stand firm in the face of fear and what that courage had cost. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear. Someone had worked very hard to erase not just Elijah Ramsey's body, but his legacy. The break came quietly, not with a dramatic confession or public reveal, but in the form of a dusty envelope left in the mailbox at the sheriff's office late one evening. No return address, no note inside, just a set of photographs. Old, worn, their corners curled with time. Atish one told a story the town had buried. In one, Elijah Ramsey stood beside David Renshaw in a wooded clearing. In another, a small shed appeared, almost hidden by brush. The final photo was the most damning. It showed 4 men standing together at dusk, barely visible in the fading light: Reverend Curtis Denton, Wesley Grant, Thomas Hargrove, and unmistakably, Sheriff Darrell Moore. Darrell stared at the photo for a long time. He remembered that night, though he had never spoken of it. It wasn't what people might assume. He wasn't part of what happened to Elijah. But he had seen something he buried so deep he convinced himself it hadn't been real. He was young then, just a deputy following orders, told to stay back while the others had a meeting in the woods. He remembered hearing raised voices, then silence. Then, later that night, being told that Reverend Ramsey had decided to leave town. He'd accepted it back then. But the guilt had eaten at him for decades. Now he knew it was time. Darrell brought the evidence to Lorraine. She looked at the photos in silence, her face unreadable. "You were there," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. He nodded. "I didn't know what they were going to do. I should have stopped them. I didn't." Lorraine held her brother's photo tightly. It's not too late. With the help of Jenny and Marcus, they returned to the clearing, this time with equipment, lights, and a full forensic team. Beneath the collapsed shed, buried under layers of earth and rotted wood, they found a second grave. This one deeper, wrapped in canvas, preserved by time and silence. The remains were confirmed within days. Elijah Ramsey had been buried less than 100 yards from where David Renshaw had been found. 2 men connected by blood, buried by betrayal. The town grieved all over again. But this time, it was not the quiet, fearful grief of not knowing. It was sharper, louder, a grief mixed with anger and shame. A community reckoning with what had been allowed to happen under their noses. Some called for charges, but the men directly responsible were gone, all but one: Thomas Hargrove. Now frail and confined to a hospital bed, was confronted with the evidence. When he saw the photo, he wept. Not for Elijah, but for himself. "We thought he was going to ruin everything." He said he wanted to give that land away. People weren't ready for that. And Grant, he said, if we didn't stop him, we'd lose everything. He confessed then. Told how they lured Elijah to the woods under the pretense of meeting David. How things got out of hand. How they tried to cover it up. How Denton insisted it would never be found. His confession was recorded. Public, There was no prosecution. He died 3 days later in the aftermath. The town finally named the land where Elijah had planned to build the housing project. It was cleared and restored, and a small monument was raised. Not just to him, but to David, and to the truth that had taken nearly 3 decades to find the light. But the twist came quietly. Just weeks after the ceremony, Jenny received another envelope. This time, it was postmarked from out of state. Inside was a birth certificate and a handwritten letter. It turns out, Elijah Ramsey hadn't just unknowingly fathered David Renshaw. He had another son, one he did know about, one he had sent away to protect during the exact same time he was fighting for the housing project. A child he kept out of the spotlight, hidden from enemies, from threats, from anyone who might have tried to use him as leverage. The letter didn't reveal the child's identity, but it ended with a line that changed everything. He's been living among you, you've heard him sing, you've watched him grow. The legacy didn't end in those woods. It's still standing, every Sunday, in the same church Elijah built. Lorraine, stunned, stared at the choir that next Sunday morning with tears in her eyes, because in that group stood a young man named Aaron, the new choir leader, raised by a foster family, with a voice so much like Elijah's it gave people chills. The story of Elijah Ramsey didn't end in silence. It lived on. For weeks after the revelation about Aaron, the town stayed in a quiet kind of awe. People who had walked past him for years suddenly looked again, not just because of who he was, but because of everything he represented. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't even know until the letter arrived, until Lorraine approached him with trembling hands and a voice full of emotion. They sat together under the same church roof Elijah had once preached beneath, and Lorraine told him the truth with tears in her eyes. Aaron sat still, eyes wide, then quietly whispered, "I always felt like I came from something, bigger." He wasn't angry. He wasn't even overwhelmed. He just wanted to understand. And so Lorraine told him about Elijah, about the strength of his spirit, his kindness, the way he stood up for what was right when it wasn't easy. She showed him pictures, read parts of Elijah's journals, let him listen to the old tape Marcus had kept hidden for years. She gave him the small, cracked leather Bible found under the tree stump. Aaron held it like it was the only thing in the world. As the community absorbed the truth, people who had long carried guilt began to step forward. A former town clerk admitted to misfiling paperwork tied to the housing project, not out of malice, but because someone pressured her to. A retired deputy shared that he'd been told not to patrol near the woods the night Elijah vanished. None of it brought Elijah back, but it pieced together the final fragments of a mystery that had haunted them all for too long. The town voted to rename the project Land Ramsey Grove, where there was once silence and overgrown brush. Construction began again. Not just homes, but a community center, a library room named after David Renshaw, and a small music hall in honor of Aaron. The town, once divided, now gathered on those grounds to work together. Side by side, pouring concrete, painting walls, sharing meals. Sheriff Darrell Moore chose not to run for re-election. After his public apology at a town meeting, he stepped down with quiet dignity. "The truth waited on me long enough," he said. "Someone younger, someone who never learned how to look the other way. That's who this town needs now." He moved to a cabin outside town and sent Lorraine handwritten notes every now and then, checking in and offering help whenever needed. Jenny Malone's work earned her national attention. She was offered bigger jobs, bigger stories, but she turned them down. This one mattered, she said. This was personal. She stayed in town, continuing to tell stories that reminded people their history still had a voice. She published a feature series titled The Roots of Truth, using every detail from the case, every face, every photo not to stir drama, but to remind people that healing begins when silence ends. Marcus Lee returned to the choir, the same place he once stood as a nervous teenager. His voice had aged, but it carried something deeper now: peace. He stood beside Aaron during that first Sunday service after the truth came out. The church was packed that morning, every pew filled, the doors wide open. Lorraine sat in the front row, holding a program that read Reverend Elijah Ramsey Memorial Service and Dedication. No sorrow lingered that day. Only light. Only memory. Only hope. And though Aaron didn't take his father's place behind the pulpit, he found his own voice in music and mentorship. He led the youth choir, taught songwriting workshops, and quietly offered guidance to kids who didn't know where they belonged. Every once in a while, someone would ask him if he ever felt like he missed out, not knowing who his father was until it was too late. And he'd smile gently and say, he left more than a name. He left something you can't bury. Lorraine, she finally let herself breathe. For years, her life had revolved around a question with no answer. Now, standing beside her nephew, she found something she never expected. Not just closure, but a new beginning. She helped oversee the Ramsey Grove Project, started a nonprofit to assist children in foster care, and became a quiet leader in the community. Just as her brother once was. The house where Elijah lived was restored and turned into a historical site, a place where people could walk through his study, see the books he read, hear audio of his sermons, and learn about the man who believed in justice before it was comfortable and unity before it was common. Visitors from neighboring towns came regularly. School children on field trips asked why-dyed questions. And every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, service was held, not in mourning, but in celebration for the life he lived, and the truth that finally rose from the shadows. The past no longer sat like a weight on the town's shoulders. It lived as a reminder, a quiet echo that still reached through the trees, through the rebuilt streets, through the church hymns sung on Sunday mornings. Elijah Ramsey didn't vanish. He was taken, yes. Hidden, yes. But his light wasn't lost. It lived in every home built on that land, in every young voice that sang in Aaron's choir, in every act of courage that grew from seeds he once planted. The truth had taken years to rise, had pushed through lies and fear and silence, but it had come strong and undeniable, and in the end, it wasn't just the mystery that was solved. It was the town itself that was found again. Sometimes, it's not about how long it takes to uncover the truth. Sometimes, it's about who's willing to keep looking when everyone else has stopped. And sometimes, the roots we think are buried forever